Welcome to the Philosophical Shorts. This one is about what is politics. Simply put, politics is about the affairs of governance, the art of government, which are ordered according to various beliefs, some good, some bad, some useful and some not. Now that's a very broad statement, to which we can add that, as with everything in life, politics is also about a state of being in the world, which invokes context, goals and intentions, methods of actions and methods of reflection. In other words, the definition of politics is context dependent and is also subject to a multidisciplinary or many perspectives approach. But all is not lost. Despite the meaning of politics being rather slippery, even subject to specific ideological and cultural historical interpretations and so on, this video reviews the core meanings of the word politics, which should help us all be aware of particular definitions that come with a specific agenda, as well as help us be more competent in reviewing the nature of politics around us. To help us get our minds around politics, we shall firstly look at a narrow definition of politics that invokes anything to do with government and nothing else. And then we shall review a broader definition that I am calling the panpolitical definition, that connotes most or all human interaction as being political. Let's start with the classical definition. The word politics invokes a principal set of meanings that have been passed down into the Western political tradition, and they invoke the activities which belong to the concept of the polis, or the ancient Greek word for the state or government. Nonetheless, the word polis also invoked in ancient Greek, and still does invoke, the concept of community, from which we gain modern derivations such as family politics, corporate politics, or sports politics, say. Arguably, this has caused much confusion in mixing the meanings surrounding distinct realms of action, and the figurative expressions that are expressed in non-state, non-governmental organisations can be blamed for logical complexities produced by writers who see that all human interaction is political to some extent or less, rather than just belonging to the actions of the official government. Now, that's not to say that the pan-political approach is wrong, but that it may need to be put aside for the while, as we make an effort to analyse, to break down the word politics to its core meanings. A famous definition of politics is from 1958. Harold Lasswell's politics is about who gets what, when and how much, which collapses political theory and party politics into a manageable box. Ostensibly, it captures the function of government into the key ideas of who, what and when and how questions, yet, well, not so fast, Harold. Who gets what, when and how much could easily explore the dealings of a Friday night family film fest, or grandparents' inheritance plans, or any businesses or charities' plans for investments, promotions or events. And since the marketplace is in the business of production and distribution flows through price signals and traders' expectations, we would have to assume that Lasswell is indeed seeking to capture a vast range of activities beyond the traditional function of government. He may be right from his perspective, but firstly, I want to pare this broad spectrum of potential activities down to a core meaning. It is often useful in philosophy to find a basic common denominator to a concept, a slimmed down version of the many meanings offered, in order to enjoy grasping something rather than trying to grasp everything. To review the classical meaning of politics, that it is about the state and statecraft, we have to also briefly consider what a state is. A state is broadly considered to be a set of institutions and personnel who have a monopoly of force over a given area. The typical institutions are an executive, a legislative, a judiciary, and the concomitant bureaucracy supporting them all. Force implies the use of the police, judges, prisons, or of the armed forces for defence, as well as the state's requirements to raise taxes for its functions, which may and typically do extend into providing infrastructures, education, healthcare, amongst other functions that democratic states finance. Aspects of that force may be delegated down to lower provincial government bodies, or may indeed be delegated upwards from the lower provincial governments to an overarching national, federal or confederate body, typically signified in the overall term the nation-state, which we will have to use as a shorthand for any recognised governmental organisation securing control and management of its forces over a given territory. At this stage then, the classical or core meaning of politics we're just talking about revolves around the functioning of a group of institutions that wield, or that can wield, force against citizens or other nation states. Politics is about the realm of state power. We're not worried at this point about whether that state is corrupt, inefficient, abusive, or the most morally wonderful government that ever existed. Just like in anatomy, we're reviewing the bits and pieces that make up a government, and hence anything that involves government we're calling politics. Continuing with this classic or minimal definition of politics, the definition that the state is about force in turn emphasises this restrictive understanding of politics. Firstly, that implies that the phrases corporate or family politics are actually redundant, incongruous, they do not fit, or simply poor logical use of terms, precisely because these other social entities do not possess any privileges over the use of force with which we characterise the state. Indeed, any use of force by families, gangs or corporations are actually deemed criminal activities, for they are not privileged or authorised by government, and hence they are outside the remit of politics proper. But it also rests on an assumption that governance always involves the use or threat of force. When we do consider the role of the state in history, we are often attracted to the wars and the violent formation of the world's nation-states and empires. Yet there are also times in history in which force and violence have been eschewed, given up by governments in favour of expanding the realm of freedom, both domestically, in terms of recognising rights, and internationally, in terms of recognising people's rights to trade across borders, say. Logically, that implies that when a state is not engaged in overt and covert military operations, it is not doing anything political. And moreover, when the size of the active state shrinks as it pulls away from domestic and foreign interventions, then the realm of politics similarly diminishes. As a corollary to the classical definition of politics, we can also note that since the early Greek meaning also implied governance or management of the polis, we can extend the term to include and describe the process or competition for political privileges by those personages who would manage or rule through government agencies, that is, those who would seek political power. This suggests that the concept of politics also includes a processual or set of dynamic processes that refer to the competition, friendly or otherwise, to gain functional political powers as wielded by a state, and the struggle between politicians and government officials for resources, prestige, and of course, political power. Each country may have its own political stories concerning political changes of direction and leadership, but in this core understanding of politics, the entire theatre revolves around securing power, and our study of politics would thus be about the analysis of the origins, the forms, the distribution, and control of power, as Adrian Leftwich notes in What is Politics. There is much to argue for this minimalist or classical definition of politics. As noted earlier, the use of power or force over an area is what we are initially drawn to. Historically, and rendered in book and film, we are often encountering individuals who seek total control over the state apparatus. The autocratic ruler, for instance, is when a state is run by a single person, and who, according to this simplistic definition, would be said to have secured complete control over all the organs of the state, whether we call this person a president, a prince, a monarch, a dictator, a Caesar, a czar, a hetman or emperor, and such terms. Most states, historically, have rarely reached that level of singular control, and on closer inspection we reveal the interplay of factions, though, either subtly in one-party states in which personalities ally and cooperate with one another for their particular, usually narcissistic or sometimes idealistic visions of state power and management, or explicitly, as in the multi-party states that characterise many modern democracies. And of course, within those particular parties, for example Democrats in the United States or Christian Democrats in Germany or the Labour Party in Australia, there will be subtly conniving and cajoling groups seeking their own influence. Similarly with the organised religions that are connected to state power, in which various factions proposing alternative interpretations may act competitively to secure state privileges. Now, the history of religion and state politics is complex and unique to different countries and cultural histories, but insofar as religious organisations wield influence over the governance of a country, beyond the common spiritual declaration that the laws of the land and the rulers' powers come from God alone and not some human social contract, say, then religion falls into the core political realm of governance and relevant privileges, breaching, one could say, Jesus' retort to the dilemma of whom we should serve. Give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and give to God that which is God's, said Jesus. In these cases, the functionality of party or personality politics is to be understood in the context of seeking influence or control over particular institutions of the state, or the entire state itself, and application of force over a given territory. Now, that core understanding of politics raises questions about legitimacy. By what right or justification are some, politicians and their officers, given privileges to wield force over a given territory? Now, that would take us into the realm of what we call political philosophy, which seeks to explore the beliefs, the ideas we hold about the need for government, its legitimacy, and the extent of its role in people's lives. And typically we explore the shift from the role of brutality, of strong monarchs or tyrants whimsically ruling over a land, to legitimised government through the covenants with the people, constrained by constitutions, and the role that spirituality, rather than religious dogmas, has in legitimising and guiding politicians and their officers. It also reviews, amongst many issues, the notions of justice and liberty within a polity, however it is construed, and other matters such as the nature and theories regarding international relations, intervention and war. Now, we may leave the core definition of politics to review more expansive definitions. The first is a simple shift that expands outward from the classical core definition to recognise that the role of power organised through state organs is not simply confined to those obvious institutions such as the ministries or departments for justice, defence, home security, the treasury, and so on. Government's largesse and its use of funds may spread further and deeper into civilian society, and hence may blur the lines between the demarcation of government activity and that of the market or civilian society generally. For instance, we can imagine a government programme to encourage economic development in a specific area of the country. Funds are accorded certain projects over others, thus politicising the spending of treasury funds in what would necessitate a clamorous lobbying for the distributions. Similarly, a culture may thus develop in which companies and civilians badger the government for more funding for their particular interests, ideological, monetary, or a mixture. In a sense, such programmes politicise society, bringing more agents within the realm of government policy and distribution of privileges and funds. In many respects, political philosophy can deal with to what extent this is morally legitimate, pragmatic, or inevitable under the classic definition of politics, just noting how the spread of political activity increases with wider government intervention in society, which thus politicises companies, charities, and individuals. Consider a medieval situation in Europe. The king and his council believe that they need to protect the land and its people from attacks by enemies in the west, so they commission a castle. Funds are spent procuring resources and workers for the project, and local towns and villages enjoy the distributions from the treasury. The castle also then stands as a deterrent to any invasion in that part of the country. However, economic logic then demands we consider that a different part of the country did not attract those funds, while it and other parts lost monies, taxes, to pay for the western defences. More subtly, while peace may have been secured by the expenditure on a castle, there may be some technological innovations that add to the economy's overall ability to produce goods and services. But on the other hand, resources have been drawn from other employments, investments, and technological innovations, whose developments may now have been thwarted. There has been what we can call a wealth shift from other peoples and regions to the West, and those organised in Western defences who are enjoying the flows of government funding are more likely to waste funds, cut corners, demand more funds, lobby for more castles or new technologies. Such is the inevitable logic of government-funded projects. A recent personal trip to a local castle underlined that exploitation of taxpayers' monies. In the 1500s, a courtier took over the castle and was commissioned to ensure that it was robust enough to secure the defence of the territory. Of course, he insisted on continual renovations using the fear of threatened invasions, while also enjoying a lavish lifestyle for his family and friends. Inevitably, political processes emerge in which other factions seek similar distributions from the treasury, or that their taxes are reduced as their regions suffer. Any government spending will create such logic, but from our point of view, reviewing what is politics, such directed expenditures politicise that region or that section of the community and set into motion a complex competition and a review of interests, economic justifications, negotiations and compromises, followed by more rounds as other parties realise their involvement, either because of rising taxes or the perceived unfairness of targeted government spending that misses their interests or regions. And so it goes on, drawing increasing numbers into the political sphere and potentially leaving a diminishing sphere of non-political activity. Now we must leave the classical definition completely and consider the possibility that politics is inherent in the human and social conditions. For the panpolitical argument, it does not matter whether governments and the apparatus of the state exist at all. Instead, relations between individuals within societies generate political relationships and are characterized as revolving around power and control over each other. Such theories thus encompass state politics, but also governance in all areas of life, including family and the relationships between individuals, such as parents acting to control children or elders seeking to secure forms of moral control over people, or employers over their staff, or grandparents over the younger generations. Thus, a romantic relationship could also be deemed political. This, the broadest of definitions, may seem to some to water down the concept too much. Is everything really political? If politics is construed to be about power relations, then we can find the interplay of power everywhere. But to allow it some credibility in this worldview, we would have to admit that anything involving a transactional exchange, a market exchange, is necessarily political. That is, when the self-interest of the parties leads to some form of exchange or arrangement in the purchase of a commodity or service. On the other hand, though, it can be countered that money is neutral, and economic logic emphasises that, in the absence of coercion or force, two parties to an exchange are both content on exchanging, one buying the product with money, the other selling the product for money, for example, and logically are, at the time of the exchange, perceiving that they will be better off than if they did not exchange. Now, they may have different perceptions afterwards, when either or both parties believe that they could have got a better deal, but at the moment of exchange and its complex context of different psychologies, intentions and motivations, they were content. Where does politics come into this? But in defence of the panpolitical theorist, we may consider that panpolitical thinkers may insist on describing market exchange as inevitably political because one of the person's needs may be more than the other's, and hence a power relationship is intrinsic. For the classical theorist and most economists, it is sufficient if two people enter an exchange voluntarily, and either or both are at least as well off or better off after the exchange. Then there can be no power or force and hence no politics involved. Emotional coercion does not come into modern microeconomics, but it can be emphasised by the Austrian school of economics. The Austrian school tends to acknowledge that there is more to an exchange than a simple exchange of money and goods. There are beliefs and expectations surrounding conceptions of present and future enjoyments of the goods and money, similar to the expectations that we all bring to friendships and intimate relationships. Now that some emotionally bully others, though, the classical political theorist would deny as being political, but an issue of interpersonal psychology. Nonetheless, the influential influential pan-political theory we know stems from Karl Marx, the author of the Communist Manifesto with his friend Friedrich Engels, and of Das Kapital, Capital, a turgid description of capitalism through Marx's reading and arguably reinterpreting of early economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Marx originally described the human condition as an inevitable movement towards a classless society in which one day there would be no class structures and hence no politics. Incidentally, there would also be no government, but this is incidental to the outcome. rewind from this apolitical utopia, and we can characterise our history and present as ridden by class conflict, and that power is predicated on class divisions between the peoples. For Marx, writing in the middle to the end of the 19th century, the classes were divided by economic characteristics in what they own and hence control. Other classes have less or even nothing, but the division between the classes is categorical and unbridgeable. In its last development, Marx envisioned two final classes before the ultimate class war between capitalists and the workers. The capitalists own all the means of production, the land and the machines and the factories, the tools, and the workers own nothing, and are increasingly pushed into poverty until they hit an extreme and hence rebel and overthrow their economic masters. Since Marx's vision of two warring classes was complicated and even contradicted by the evidence that in a relatively free economy poor people could own the means of production as well and could even become rich, and the rich could lose their monies, and that overall the majority could enjoy increasing standards of living, as Marx himself was aware of during his lifetime, and which has become blatantly evident over the past 2 centuries, the simplistic vision of politicising economic relations diminished in popularity. Instead, undeterred neo-Marxists explored other versions of the property angle to characterise society as innately political, to include vague notions of cultural property or even racial property, as in critical race theory, in which an identifiable race is deemed to possess property rights over other races, its whiteness in its current rendition as a mode of excluding all other races from enjoying the freedoms or wealth that the elite race enjoys. Now this has echoes of early 20th century eugenics and racial theories, but is inverted to demand forms of equality of opportunity and equal outcomes or equity for the non-privileged races. Both modern renditions of Marx rely on a simplistic notion that any human relationship can be characterised by what the previous philosopher, German philosopher who had a huge influence on Marx, called Gottfried Hegel, called a master and slave relationship, in which each, the master and the slave, will seek to overpower the other, and that the two categories of people, the masters and the slaves, are somehow easily identifiable and neatly boxed into an us versus them mentalisation of the human world, ignoring willfully or psychologically all the troublesome nuances that the human world gleefully presents to theorists. This was a way of continuing Karl Marx's message, borrowed from Hegel, that the human condition was inextricably political by virtue of this clash of classes or races or religions or sexes, and hence, with or without a state, political relationship is inherent in the human condition. In the sense of consciousness or being in the world, much political analysis is based on this us versus them scenario, the rulers versus the ruled, or the propertied versus the non-propertied, in various disguises. This is the realm of pure survival, with varying degrees of force relations between people, such as, I'll only survive in life if I control others, or I'll only survive in life if I kill others, or their political versions, such as, government is needed to control people, and a state only gains status by waging war with others. Whether we take the panpolitical definition or the classical definition of politics, when the psychological or the consciousness element revolves around this us versus them and we need control over something or someone, the purpose of politics becomes to enforce values by some over others. But if we shift to a different level of being, of understanding, then force and brutality is required less as a mode of operation against everyone, a game of who is going to wield the club, to a modality of reconciling differences with reference to higher values such as statesmanship, democracy, accountability, transparency of government in which rules are evaluated on their usefulness for the common good rather than for the people in power. Politics can then be unleashed from its original and persistent characterization, either on a narrow or broad definition, dependent on survival through force, to one of mutual advantageousness, of wisdom and selflessness, of philosophical advancement through negotiations and policies, just as Plato, the Greek philosopher, envisioned over 2,000 years ago with his philosopher kings. Yet, we have learned a lot since then. Some may be wise in politics, but often they are drowned out by the more numerous self-seeking and exploitative officials of the state, and who, as we have witnessed in many a democracy, act to anchor political relations in the mire of perpetual war. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you got something out of this video lecture. I look forward to reading any comments that you wish to leave, and in the meantime, all the best in your own endeavours in life. I'm Dr. Alexander Mosley.